All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, especially after the tragic events of last evening. Although our first speaker, Professor Depoorter, is actually a Duke fan, so we'll forgive him for that. Professor Depoorter is a professor at the Center for Advanced Studies in Law and Economics at Ghent University in Belgium. And this fall, he'll be starting at the University of Miami School of Law as an associate professor. He was a Fulbright scholar, and he's co-editor of the Review of Law and Economics. His talk this morning will be on political externalities, the supply and demand of disaster management, and Professor Artie Rai of Duke will be giving some comments. So please welcome Professor Depoorter.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to the Duke Law Journal for hosting this wonderful conference. I want to emphasize that although I'm taking a position at Miami next year, and I know that there's a lot of talk about empirical legal, I'm not doing that to gather empirical data. I'm basically just going there for other reasons. Just wanted to stress that out. And since I have the honor of opening today's session and sessions in the symposium, I thought it'd be helpful to go over some of the general lessons that we have drawn from the disaster of Hurricane Katrina. The tragedy of those events have led to a consensus of what must or can be done to improve in the future. Some of these points of attention are by now familiar to all of you, so let me just quickly run over them. Were basically assessed to be a major part of destruction of home and businesses. Evacuation routes were lacking. Shelters were certainly not sufficient. And communication failed on many levels of government. Leadership was a big issue. No one was really clearly in charge, and there were problems of cutting through the bureaucratic red tape. And then obviously, in terms of pre-planning, a lot was lacking. A lot of it seemed ad hoc. A general observation on the field basically was that it seemed that as planners had mistakenly not paid attention to the fact that many things in daily life would be missing, and that those things actually would play a big role in hampering relief efforts. Now, as I go over these points of attention, you might wonder, did I read this in the White House report on Katrina, report by Congress, or other reports? Well, actually, you might, and in fact, they are in those reports. But my quotations here are from different reports. They're actually from a very different time as well. All of these quotations, these points of attention, date from 1992, after Hurricane Andrew passed through Florida. And so I'm basically quoting from a Miami Herald report, a Dade County grand jury report, and a report on the level of the state. And that, and moreover, the Dade County report concluded by expressing frustration at the community's failure to learn from its previous experience, and expressed a fear that the same mistakes would be repeated again. So it turns out that those recommendations in themselves in 1992 were not new. And that certainly gives us an idea that despite it being decried, every time such a disaster occurs, we do not draw adequate lessons from the past. So that's basically the premise of this paper. We have a lack of emergency preparedness, and my research question is what explains the failure of government to engage in rational decision-making with regard to mitigation and relief planning. The government currently spending billions of dollars on relief and reconstruction, while it consistently shorted investments that would have reduced those costs at a small percentage. That's what I define with being rational decision-making in ex-ante level. And what I'm particularly intrigued by, as I started out this paper, was the contrast between ex-ante and ex-post investments in disaster management. Involvement on the ex-ante level seems very low and lacking, whereas ex-post, after disaster, there seems to be political goodwill, and we see a big contrast between the level of expenditure. Now, my analysis and the way I went about with this research was to take a step back and provide a more general account of the political process which brought about the disaster management as we have it today. There's a lot of rich and detailed stories to be told about things that went wrong and could be improved, but what I wanted to do is take a step back and tell a macro level story, if you will, of what happened. And what I want to look at in terms of political process is what determines supply and demand of disaster management on political markets. Demand being voters, supply being obviously the political level. Now, a first obvious statement, which is held true and basically accepted wisdom in public choice theory and that would apply to emergency management quite straightforward, is that ad hoc disaster management is, the payoffs of that politically are obviously much higher than ex ante investments. Ad hoc relief efforts of sending in troops, supplies is much more visible, it's more subject to media reports, and also more fundamentally, ad hoc relief efforts are captured immediately by politicians. Whereas investments ex ante, it's not certain that you will capture them yourself. You might no longer be in office. So that's a basic explanation which public choice sends out with regard to ex ante versus ex post. But I believe that's not a very sufficient, I don't think this explanation is sufficient in itself to explain the discrepancy between ex ante and ex post, because it doesn't really fully specify why we would not have visible politically rewarding ex ante planning, which would make ex post relief efforts more effective. There's certainly political gain, potential political gain there. Ex ante planning might make ad hoc relief more effective and so forth, politically rewarding. Now, again, the short time span horizon of politicians applies here, but I believe that there's also something more fundamental going on, and that has to do, and is basically the subject of my paper, the fact that political responsibilities in disaster management are shared across political actors. And this comes from the basic observation that in disaster management, there is something, what I would call correlated political accountability or correlated political liability among different levels of government. The scale of such disaster are of nature that both in the minds of the public, different levels of government are all accountable, are expected to come to the rescue. And also in terms of ex ante ex post, so as a matter of public perception, but also if you look formally at how responsibilities are assigned to different levels of government, you find that there is a large range of overlap. I won't go into the details, but for instance, evacuation, where quite explicitly the state and local level are assigned responsibility. Even there's a residual responsibility for the federal government to assist those procedures. So there is somewhat of a shared responsibility, and that really brings, and that disaster management as such then boils down to some of the issues that we confront when we're dealing with common pool problems. A supply of disaster relief resembles a electoral collective action problem. You need some amount of disaster management, but without optimal coordination, you might risk having suboptimal supply. And what I look into deeper in the paper is that the effect of shared responsibilities is of a nature that political actors take into account each other's action. They look strategically, because in a situation of common pool, each actor's decisions and actions influence the other. On a political market, if one goes in and sends relief troops, that obviously affects how another political actor, political level, comes across and might have an impact on in the next electoral cycle. So that's basically the topic of this paper. What are these political cross effects? I want to identify them, and what role do they play? And the thesis of my paper really is that these strategic effects in the common pool problem that is disaster management are different for ex ante and ex post investments. So let me explain this facet. In ex ante level, when we talk about investments in prevention, if we talk about investments mitigation, if we talk about relief planning ex ante, these type of investments, they confer positive externalities to other political actors, to competitors, and so forth, in the sense that these investments reduce the chance that not only themselves, but also that other levels of government will be implied politically, held accountable, and also it reduces their expected financial exposure of themselves, but also of others. And so that's the idea, is that they're not capturing the full benefits of their investments ex ante, and this is a positive, this is really created in economic terms as a positive externality, of which we all know that it really leads to underproduction. Ex post, on the other hand, ad hoc relief efforts, sending troops after the disaster, that corresponds with negative externalities. By engaging in sending troops, is ad hoc ex post efforts, you make others look, you make yourself look better as a political actor, and you make others look worse. For instance, if the state of Florida sends in troops to Louisiana, that affects the governor of Texas in that, well, you don't want to look weak, others are looking better, you probably gives you an incentive to also jump in and add to that rescue activities. And that applies both within the state as well as between states. Between states, obviously, in a T-boat model of federal competition, you want your state to look good as compared to other states, and that applies in terms of exit voice loyalty, that voters might switch states, but also within your state, the electoral pressure is obviously even stronger, in that as an incumbent, you don't want to look weak on disaster management, especially in a hurricane-prone region, because that will come to the advantage of your competitors. And so the basic idea, the cue from economics, is that negative externalities, as opposed to positive externalities, tend to be overproduced. You impose a cost on others, and you're not internalizing that cost, so you tend to not take them into account. Now, and this is basically the idea that I developed in this paper, that in acting in a setting of shared responsibilities, you have something called what I term horizontal political externalities between governments. Now, these horizontal political externalities, they impose something that is well known, which is called vertical political externalities, which is the cost that government imposes on citizens, that they don't internalize themselves as politicians. And so that gives rise to the fundamental question: if these horizontal externalities, if the strategic action between politicians imposes costs on citizens in terms of suboptimal supply of disaster management, weak preparedness, and that's supposed to cost on citizens, do politicians as a group then not carry do they as a group not bear the cost of that in terms of electoral dissatisfaction? Well, that's basically a very fundamental question, because if indeed these horizontal externalities are borne by politicians, if they internalize these costs, we would expect them to disappear. Now, there's two reasons why why there's cause for pessimism in this regard. And it's, first of all, fundamentally very straightforward. There are political transaction costs. If these externalities exist, it takes some amount of collusion to overcome them, and between political competitors, that's not always obvious. Think of the idea of bipartisanship and how hard it is to achieve some of those strategies. But then also more fundamentally, there's another reason why perhaps this internalization is imperfect, and this has to do with the fact that political accountability, the check that is being presented to politicians, is all usually a matter of public perception. And public perception is something that is obviously very ephemeral, and it's not always easy to decipher what amount of political accountability will be forthcoming. And so I argued that because of the shared responsibility, it creates a certain noisiness, certain inference. And the thesis I develop, the second hypothesis I make in the paper, is that when political responsibilities are concurrent, if they are shared, no single actor bears full responsibility, while uncertainty and finger-pointing might have the effect of reducing overall accountability. And this is the term, the sub-additivity or political accountability deadweight losses. So the idea is that since it's shared, perhaps not all the accountability, some of the accountability goes lost. I first I stumbled on this idea when I read about the USA USA Today CNN Gallup poll. The poll was basically, how much accountability do you assign to different levels of government? And it was shortly after Katrina, and the White House responsibility was pointed to as 13%. And so from that point, I thought, well, 13%, that's not much. And in the study, the poll wasn't drawn up this way, but I thought if you did a cumulative checking of the different levels of government, you might not even get close to 100%. So that intrigued me and led me to an experimental study at Ghent University with students to see whether there is something to the idea of political deadweight losses when responsibilities are shared. And so what we did was we basically ran an experiment with 400 undergraduate students, and we gave them a scenario of both of them we gave an identical scenario where there was a flooding in Belgium, and we divided the students in two groups. Both the same scenario of a flooding, but in group one, we basically told them, well, there is one political body responsible for the 3 causes that have led to this flooding. And in the second group, we have the same scenario, but we said there are 3 governmental agencies, and each of them was actually responsible for one of the facets that led to the flooding. And so we asked them, how much accountability do you shift in the first group to that one body? And the second group had to assign over the 3 bodies. And what we did find is, in a statistically significant way, is that political accountability was higher when there was only one body assigned, whereas accountability was much lower. This is the second. Let's see. This is the second table. Basically, when it was divided over 3, it was much less accountability. So some accountability goes lost due to the nature of the institutional design of having several. And so diffuse political duties lead to lower overall levels of accountability. And that sheds a light on the blame game that is ongoing still today. In blame game, the finger pointing by different levels of government might actually be a profitable electoral strategy, not just individually as politicians, but also as a group it might actually be maximizing. Now, if there is such a, if there is such confounding, or if political externalities and political deadweight losses are really confounding ex post assessments in an indirect way and has a negative impact on ex ante levels of investment in disaster management, why do voters not simply demand an efficient amount of ex ante investment in disaster management straightforward? And there, of course, we need to turn to theories of cognitive psychology and social psychology with regard to disaster management, which is basically, and there will be more talk of this today, so I won't go into this too widely, but disaster is obviously a low probability event with extreme loss potential, and there cognitive psychologists generally recognize that there's a tendency to underestimate risk prior to disasters. Cognitive limitations, what is really 1 in 100,000 chance? How much is that? Cognitive dissonance, something that I fully intend to engage in once I arrive in Miami. I'll just think of it. If I buy a house, I'll just cognitive dissonance. It's not a big factor. And then when after disaster strikes, there's a tendency, on the other hand, to overestimate your availability heuristic, hindsight bias, of which we'll hear more today. So there's an exaggerated preference ex post, almost a preference switch with regard to voters. And in some sense, we should not be too optimistic about this direct demand in that regard, since whatever politicians do, if they invest ex ante, if nothing happens, it's not something voters want, and then if something happens, it's never enough. So there's somewhat of a perverse incentive working there. No matter what you do, it's not going to be good news in terms of satisfying voter preferences. So there is a pervasive problem there. Now, in terms of policy options, what I try to do in the paper is really a descriptive, positive theory of a positive political theory. So I'm cautious of running ahead of myself in terms of translating this into normative statements. But I do believe that political externalities and political deadweight losses go some way in go some way in providing additional insights into some of the reform proposals that we see today. Every reform proposal is a balancing of, needs to balance in itself certain trade-offs and certain facets, and I believe in terms of institutional design that there are some facets to be picked up. Let me just briefly go over them, and I apologize to my discussant that I wasn't able to share this with her early on. This is very much last-minute work. But that's, of course, the idea of this conference is that I would be able to strengthen this part. But first of all, if I am to point to any policy conclusions, there's a few ones that very much immediately come to mind. One is that if fragmented political liability leads to strategic decision-making, it leads to lower overall political accountability, the most direct means of addressing that problem is simply to consolidate and to assign political responsibilities to fewer actors. Type of horizontal integration, if you will, or bundling. And there are recent proposals in that direction. I won't go into details, but there's the idea of, there's the call of increased federalization, that there's the idea of one level of government being able to superimpose itself on others more so than in the past. There's the idea of military deployment. And those proposals make sense in many ways. They run into a number of conventional problems. Local levels often have superior information, and larger bureaucracies also lead to higher interagency administrative costs. But if we will, in terms of centralizing, the truth is that you can only make a bureaucracy so big before it becomes a layered segment of different departments. Right? For instance, a huge FEMA has local departments, and so the real trade-off with centralization is really between sharing duties between different governmental entities or sharing duties between departments within one agency. I think that's the true trade-off that we face when we talk about consolidation. And I just want to share a few words on that point. That kind of brings to mind the ideas of and the analysis regarding theory of the firm, right? Where the decision whether to locate activities within a firm or on the market is a trade-off between monitoring costs in the labor context with employees, or contract costs in terms of strategic action, defining performance, the usual information and strategic cost of dealing by way of contract. So the equivalent with regard to regulation of disaster management is a trade-off between monitoring costs in a larger agency versus coordination costs across agencies. But political deadweight losses obviously add a part to that balance, in that across agencies it might be more difficult to evaluate governmental performance. We do not know what goes on. Governmental agencies are almost black boxes, whereas it's easier to kind of decipher the accountability across agencies. So that's one important thing, in that when centralized, on the one hand, it leads to higher political accountability, but on the other hand, what goes inside is harder. So really, what it really then boils down to when we talk about centralization is the person on top of the pyramid, the political actor that we've centralized the duties into, how much he is going to bear full accountability. And this is the advantage, that there won't be fragmentation, there won't be political deadweight losses. But the trade-off between that benefit is the trade-off between that and the cost. And the cost is that when an agency is much bigger, it might just simply be very hard for one politician or one political responsible agent to maneuver such a huge administration. So you basically have a final trade-off, which is between the benefit of higher accountability and then the cost of increased information asymmetry from the principal, which is the politician, and the agent, which is the the agency. And so you basically have to trade off both of these, and because if you're not careful, you run into the same perverse incentive in that it might be too hard to do a good job anyway if the administration is too big. And so you might not bother as much since you're condemned no matter what. Two more points before I close off. Increasing accountability ex ante. I think the analysis, as I put it in the paper, brings to light a different perspective on the Good Samaritan dilemma. There's this basic idea in a lot of relief and disaster management is that there is somewhat of a moral hazard on ex-ante prevention efforts. If one level of government comes in and helps out, is due to humanitarian concerns and so forth, is bound to come in and help out anyway, it provides a moral hazard problem on the local or the other level of governments in that why engage in optimal ex-ante, we're going to be helped out anyway. And I believe that the Samaritan dilemma here with the idea of political externalities puts on a different face in that you might not only have a moral hazard from one level of government to another, in some ways there's a moral hazard problem between ex-ante and ex-post within one government agency. If political rewards of ad hoc ex-post investments are much higher, you might want to reduce or it might affect your decision on how much ex-ante to engage in. And then third factor is when we look at policy options, which I plan to do further in the next few hours while listening to other papers, but also of the next few weeks before the crucial deadline, is that one of the things, one of the real solutions you want to get at is how do we improve accountability? And of course, in many ways, that is the holy grail question. If I did have the definite answer on that, I would probably not share it here, but would just start my consulting company in DC. But a few basic points that are, I think, noteworthy here is that public perception of performance and assignability is not fine-grained. That's one of the reasons why I believe we have issues of externalities and we have the political deadweight losses issue. And the blame game, we've seen that the blame game, at least the empirical, the slight empirical evidence that there is, it does assign accountability in different ways, quite randomly, and might dissipate some of it. So we do want to tackle this if we want to improve our political processes. And there's many things we could talk about here, but one thing I want to focus on before I close off is the issue of legal liability. It's in many ways, I do find it remarkable. I'm not a full-time administrative law professor. So when you do read the materials, you sometimes are surprised in a way that someone else is no longer surprised. And that what I found is that in terms of legal liability, there's very wide exemptions for government, almost all levels, exemptions with regard to whatever happens with regard to disaster and their actions. And the standard explanation for that is that if you would assign liability on political actors, it would lead to inertia. The idea of inertia, while they won't do anything, they'll be scared to act. And I found that curious in that it seems to neglect the idea of the distinction between type 1 and type 2 errors, right? Why is it inconceivable that government could be held liable also for not acting, or for omitting to act? And so I want to look deeper into that, and I'm looking for answers, because I do believe that legal liability might have a lot of disadvantages, but at least what this analysis brings to the fore is that that accountability is somewhat lacking, and there's it's hard to be denied that there's an information value in having a court-based decision on certain acts of negligence. First of all, it brings a lot of spotlight, media attention, which leads to higher accountability, and they have a certain amount of neutrality that is not necessarily the case, or not as strong when we have independent reports, or we have the Congress stepping in, or certainly the White House. And so it might be one way of which we might override some of the blame game. There's other options of assigning the blame game, but I don't think my thoughts are developed enough on that point. So I want to conclude my presentation with a basic statement that what I've drawn from is more of a cynical theory of what political actors do. I'm not denying that many politicians in the wake of these events act out in the interest of the public. Public interest is certainly a consideration, but if you do accept that politicians are concerned with re-election, that means they're concerned about their standing relative to competitors in different levels of government. And so they also look at what others are doing. And the idea is that this type of strategic decision, whenever that turns on, it's not necessarily, and often it is not going to be the efficient decision. And by bringing these, the tiers of public externalities and public debt weight losses to the fore, I believe I think we have an important tool in our hands to evaluate reform and institutional changes, because there's a striking lack of preparedness that seems to repeat itself. Now, and I want to close off on that, the exact empirical value of the strength of these effects are of course not, I don't have any absolute data on that, apart from the experimental data that I just briefly outlined. But I nevertheless think that it might be something that provides new insights to an area where we have run into a lot of surprises. So thank you for your attention.
So I want to thank Ben for a very interesting paper. I wasn't surprised when I learned that Ben also is interested in doing intellectual property questions, or he's teaching intellectual property, and because the metaphor of the common pool resource, of course, comes up in intellectual property and property all the time, and so it was a metaphor that, or an actual reality in this case, that I think I was intuitively drawn to. There are a couple of different points that Ben makes that I think it would be interesting to disentangle a little bit. One point is the conventional point that voters pay a lot more attention ex post than they do ex ante. So for all of the cognitive psychological reasons that Ben has alluded to, there is this idea of a rule of rescue. So we are very attentive to what happens after the disaster has taken place and what rescue efforts are taking place, whereas we're much less attentive to what goes on beforehand. And here I would just add, and this is relevant for purposes of Katrina in particular, that we tend to be particularly high levels of cognitive dissonance when it comes to quote unquote natural risks as opposed to more high-tech risks. And so as a consequence, it probably is the case that natural disasters are the worst in this context in terms of the inability to process risk properly. So that's a problem independent of how many different actors you have, how many political actors you have operating on the scene. And I think Ben acknowledges that. However, it's not entirely clear what proportion of the problem is just that, the fact that, we've got problems with risk perception, and that'll be the subject of the afternoon panel. And then what percentage of the problem is the second set of problems that has to do with externalities and the fact that no level of government can internalize all the costs and benefits. And it would be, as Ben has pointed out, it's hard to get good empirical data on that sort of question, but it would be good to have some sense of the proportional contribution. Of course, there are interaction effects going on, and I think Ben's paper alludes to those interaction effects between those two distinct problems that probably create synergies of interesting sorts. But to get some sense of empirical the relative contribution of those two problems would be interesting, and I wonder whether there'd be possibilities for doing empirical work in looking at disasters that took place where there was a centralized response, say a federal response only, versus another disaster that involved 3 different levels of response. Having said that, I think there are problems with doing that empirical work because even if we're talking about a centralized actor in sort of formal terms, no actor is actually that centralized. So if we were talking about a federal response, for example, we'd be talking about usually a bunch of different agencies, which would pose all of the same externality problems, not precisely the same ones as the federal-state problem, but individual agencies conceivably would operate in the same sort of framework as federal versus state, the federal versus state actors. And so we might get some of the same problems going on. And even the blame game could be sub-additive in the way that Ben discusses with respect to federal agencies. So you would really have to have a situation where there was a single federal agency where the buck stopped. And even there, and Ben kind of alludes to this in some of his policy suggestions, even there, if we centralized within one agency, so that would be the equivalent of centralizing within one firm, well then at that point you get agency costs, which end up looking not too different from the externalities that to which Ben is referring. You don't want to make your coworker look good, and so therefore perhaps you won't engage in things that engage in activities that would confer positive externalities upon your coworker. Now this is related to agency costs, but one could frame it in the language of externalities as well. Now, in terms of policy solutions, being an intellectual property person, I immediately think of ways to incentivize. If you're talking about essentially what's happening here is ex ante, you're getting underinvestment, and ex post overinvestment. So an intellectual property person would conceive of this as a underinvestment ex ante and then a race, and a rent dissipating race ex post. So what we'd like to do, and this is somewhat contra to what Ben is suggesting, rather than centralization, perhaps we'd like to have competition between different levels of government ex ante. Competition ex ante for some sort of prize creates races. Now races can be rent dissipating and cause overinvestment, but here it seems like all the pushes towards ex post investment as opposed to ex ante investment. So perhaps we could have prizes at different levels of government for achieving certain risk prevention goals, and then you'd get different levels of government competing for those prizes, or we could have different agencies competing for those prizes. So I tend to, I guess maybe this is my bias in general coming out, believe in the value of competition as opposed to coordination to produce public goods. And as long as there are ways of capturing the externalities that you get through that competition through something like a prize. So all in all, a very interesting paper. I'm just not sure at the end of the day, though, whether we can identify the relative contributions of the different problems sufficiently to come up with policy solutions that would be attentive to the relative contributions of the different problems.
You decide. All right. Well, do we want to open it up for questions?
So I'm really intrigued by the experiments that you ran in Ghent, because it seems to me that one implication of that is that that has implications for the theory of the unitary executive, that we, the people, might want as unitary an executive as possible, because then it will minimize this problem that you're talking about, the deadweight law of the dissipation, everybody saying, I don't know who to blame. And then, in fact, the central executive might not, for the same reason, want that centralization. So the question is, well, why does the central executive in fact want it so badly? Well, maybe this is because we, the people, might expect lots of bad things to happen, so we want to make sure the blame gets appropriated, right? The executive having more rosy glasses, this couldn't possibly be about a current executive, but just in general, having more rosy glasses might be thinking only good things are going to happen. Therefore, I want a centralization. So it could be that, in fact, if you're right, we should say to the executives that want to have centralization, great, go ahead on. Let's make it as unitary as possible, because us here, correctly imagine that there's going to be bad things coming down the road. You might be underestimating them. So you have your own bias here, and the result of which is this will be a virtuous outcome for us.
Wonderful, I got it. Should I maybe I'll stop at this point.
Okay. So I love that idea. That's it's very helpful, and it's very interesting. And to suggest that perhaps there is a bias on a political level that we might be able as voters to profit from. And it is true that if indeed they are more optimistic, that would lead to a conclusion that maybe we should benefit from that. But on the other hand, it cuts against the idea that and something that was implicit in some of what we usually talk about, is that it's the voters that are more irrational and that have the optimism ex ante and the pessimism ex post. And so it goes a little against the standard idea. The assumption is that, you know, individuals as a group are less rational than, and we hope that the politicians are the rational ones, and the problem that we often perceive that they're exploiting the irrationality of the voters. So, but that's not necessarily, that's of course an empirical question, and in some cases there might be over-optimism. I mean, politicians are not entities, they're also individuals, and over-optimism, attribution bias, you know, the idea that you can do things better than others, might also play in that regard. Because one of the reasons why we all know that some politicians become politicians because of their ego, right? So, but I like that point. And
I know Matt was just really quickly, when I was out, the we action that was sort of we in this room. What I mean is, I'm not saying the voters are good. I'm saying we should sort of keep quiet, right? When,
I see. No.
It'll be a secret
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
Don't webcast this. Let's encourage the president to want to centralize because we, right-thinking people, by definition, we're right-thinking business right? We in this room, we really have a better sense of what's going on.
Yeah, well, sure. If we think that on the basis of this work is indeed a good idea for centralization, and we can get away with it by putting it to the politicians that way, because they are over-optimistic, that would just help our cause. That's true. Absolutely. Maybe first I'll respond to the interesting notes. I'll just pick out two things that you said that spoke to me. The idea of the agency costs and how this issue of externalities making others look better, look worse, whether that also applies just on any level, on any piece of interaction. It's a comparative struggle of who looks good and who looks bad. Yeah, so it's just life. That's true. But I certainly respond to that. I would respond to that in the following way. Yes, that is true. But when we're talking about policy making, we're concerned about the people that we can actually, as voters, as in the political process, that we can hold accountable. We don't have insight into whether worker X is doing this to worker Y, but we look at the gatekeeper. So the focus of the paper is to have, to focus on how can we increase accountability on the gatekeeper, which is the person on top of the administration, and then where that feeds through to political responsibility. But your point is certainly, it's certainly true that also plays, but I think there's only a limit. We have to look at the person that is monitoring that kind of interaction. So that's, I think that's a pragmatic limitation of the analysis that is necessary. As to the alternative suggestion of increasing competition ex ante, of course, in the common pool model, certainly competition is a bad thing in terms of it leading when there are when there are externalities at play, competition leads to market failure, right? So you want to correct that, and having a prize would be one way of solving the problem, in that if you are able to set out certain disaster management goals, you could in fact encourage them to do that by giving them other awards that are not necessarily subject to externalities that can be internalized. So the idea of prize is indeed a very neat solution to that, in that it's something that can be captured, that solves the problem that it can be captured. Politicians can entirely capture it, and there's no spillovers to the others. And that is true, but it depends on two conditions: that we can define what those preset goals are. So it involves information costs, and which also, if you say, I like what the market does here, and I don't like coordination, setting a price involves a certain amount of coordination. Right? You need a benevolent despot that says, well, this is what we need to do, so we'll incentivize you. So that is coordination in some way. And a trade-off that is certainly there is that setting a price sets a race about, and a race also leads to duplicative costs. Right? Think of any, even admissions. It leads to people overextending, and resources are being wasted in terms that it's a competitive struggle. So there are certain costs, but it's still a very interesting.
The thing I'd say about the race model, I actually don't think races are as duplicative and costly, especially when you're talking about races ex ante to come up with new innovations and risk prevention, because people do it in different ways. And so even if one person gets the prize, you'll get other people getting stuff out there.
So the spillovers, you're optimistic about spillovers.
Yeah, so.
Possible. Yeah, Matthew was first, I think.
Yeah. Follows up again on last couple comments. I mean, I think it's important to be clear what sort of costs and benefits we're talking about here, right? I mean, the model is at least starts off being a model of political externalities. That is, costs and benefits for the full supply or undersupply of goods that matter to politicians, right? Now, what's that good? I take it the good you're focusing on is credit, right? Politicians care about credit, and the point is that ex post there is going to be an oversupply, or at least there's going to be a negative externality with respect to credit. Namely, if I go rescue, right, that would down to my credit, but you lose credit for that, right? Ex ante, I may underinvest in things which would produce credit ex post because I recognize that you, not I, will get credit for that, right? So it's not a, so it's a special kind of good, right? It's good of getting credit. So just a couple thoughts about that. One is, and it's, I mean, in general, as with any good, right, given externalities, positive or negative, the market will reach a point, may reach a point which is greater suboptimal, which is not efficient with respect to credit. One question is why politicians just don't transact around that. And you point to transaction costs. It would seem that, I mean, generally, Katrina may be unusual, but generally the folks who get credit for responding to a disaster in place are either the Fed or the state. So it's two actors. You think they would work out some deal to get to the efficient point, that is, to get around the political deadweight losses. Maybe they don't, because credit may not matter to politicians. That's something we need to think about. That ultimately politicians care about getting reelected, right? I mean, credit's nice, but I think when seriously needs to think about, at least in the U.S., about gerrymandering and about the fact that, at least at the federal level, being really in the House is a lifetime job, right? There's safe seats. So if credit is, I mean, credit's simply instrumental to being reelected, and it's not that valuable because the chance of not being reelected is low, right? It's not clear why politicians care much about credit. The other point, this is sort of the major point, which is that an efficient allocation of credit is not the same thing necessarily as something that's socially efficient, right? That depends on why people assign credit. If people assign credit in ways which is socially inefficient, then we don't necessarily want an efficient assignment of credit to politicians, right? So we need to go back and this connects to the point about cognitive biases and so forth on the part of citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. As to that latter point, absolutely true. In that, is this on? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. In that, we want to. But I set out that the ideal position is that we get to efficient, but so that might be a limitation in the political process as in itself that voters would never want it. But it's still, and that brings to mind in the entire discussion of how much do we want to override voter preferences with regard to risk, something that will be discussed more at length this afternoon. And it's a very interesting issue. There's different theories on this. If you read the literature on risk management, some say, well, you shouldn't care about voters at all, override them. And there's other models that say the opposite. No, we should in fact, the public is right, and politicians are often wrong. So I don't, that's kind of outside of the ambit of the paper here, except for where I point to the fact that when we talk about demand, this is something you need to mention, at least when I do it, I talk about the cognitive biases. But I don't want to get too deep into that. As to your statement, is credit important to being, is credit important if it's only for re-election? That's of course a even darker version of the public choice story. See, but the public choice story, you always risk of appearing to be the dark lord of the dark side, but you're taking it to a new level, and I thank you for that, because comparative standing is important. It's, I believe that might be true for some politicians that are set, but I believe when we talk about disaster, and we talk about situations that really have an emotional response with the public, and it leads to the overestimation, the hindsight bias. Those create very strong emotional responses, and I think that is often, and we see that leads to tremendous shifts often if an election is at the right time. I think of the dioxin crisis in Europe, where we basically saw almost any government in any country where the dioxin crisis was a national scare. the government was toppled into tremendous amounts, just basically because people said, well, this is clear, there's much blame here, and we don't like the incumbent anymore because of this, we feel insecure. So in some cases, I think if the stars are aligned, I think that credit with regard to disaster management can be very important electorally and is due for concern for the ex-ante. One or two more questions. I think Tom was first and then the gentleman.
To suggest something that you say ex post credit is something that people are trying to obtain. It could also be blame, as we saw in the Katrina situation. It may be a net bad, the reaction, and it may do politically a bad thing for politics. That suggests something else. There's a possibility that it suggests a different citizenry is really that stupid, which is possible, then you may not have deadweight efficiency losses. You may have just the opposite. When we start assigning blame, not efficiency, but accountability losses, you may get more than 100% of accountability, of blame being assigned for something by the populace. And so I think you at least ought to consider that possibility as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting in that the question really is perhaps it's not entirely correct to do as I've done to take 100% as the benchmark. Maybe without the blame game, you might actually be at 20, and with the blame game, you might move to 40. So it's relative again. So that's a good point. But I think the point remains that the blame game is, even though it might lead to higher, if there might be some super additivity, the problem with the blame game is that it's noisy information. It's only where it's negative, and I mean that in that way, in that it diffuses responsibility quite randomly, and I mean that in the sense that it's not very informative necessarily. For instance, when I have this section on the blame game in the paper, and I basically, it's 1.5 pages with footnotes, and I cut down three other pages full of blame. So the blame goes back and forth, and it's based on, it's not necessarily credible information. So even though it might lead to higher accountability, it might not lead to the right type of accountability. So, that's where the issue of externalities becomes important, because if it doesn't assign accountability in any meaningful, substantive way, it doesn't correct. The blame game certainly adds to the externality issue. But that's a very good point that there's probably two levels, one of which is just blame, and one of which is correct, sound assigning responsibilities. Thanks for that. Your last question.
This idea of blame game is really interesting. And I wanted to push you a little bit on the idea that the way to assign blame is, the correct way of looking at it is, a federalism model between states and the federal government. I would argue that governments are a they and not a it. And you're going to see blame games going on between Republicans and Democrats. You're going to see, as in the 9/11, Clinton's fault or Bush's fault. And I just don't know how you're going to get around, even if you had, a residual claim holder of this blame, how you're going to get around the idea of Congress just using it as a principal agent problem and just firing who's ever at the top. I mean, fixing this problem, the blame problem just seems to be part of having a disaster, a catastrophe of any sort. I just don't know how you're going to get around that.
I think that's certainly true. I don't think there's not much reason to be optimistic that the blame game in any way can be, can be made to disappear. But I believe that in terms of institutional reform, you can mitigate the problem or reduce the effect of the blame game and the noise information with more clear signals, information signals that the public will adhere more to or find more credible than the blame game. Because I think citizens are smart enough to see that the blame game is also something that is very subjective, and people have an agenda, and so that information, even though it has an information value, I think objective news reporting goes only so far. But then if you have, for instance, a judge-based ruling, I think that works much stronger than one party saying that the other person So that there are perhaps institutional reasons that we could, there's possibly a certain amount of institutional design that will provide information that has more counterweight against the blame game than other types of institutional design. And legal liability is one way, but there must be others, and I hope we do find. But there's certainly a limitation. You're right about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a very interesting presentation, and I thought before introducing our next two speakers that it would be a good idea to let you know how they and